Acquisition in the federal government encompasses much more than just the procurement cycle of soliciting, awarding, managing, and closing out contracts. Acquisition is acquiring products or services by contract, including construction, by and for the use of the federal government through purchase or lease, whether the products or services are already in existence or must be created, developed, demonstrated, and evaluated. Acquisition begins at the point when agency needs are established and includes the description of requirements to satisfy agency needs, solicitation and source selection, award of contracts, contract financing, contract performance, contract administration, and those technical oversight and programmatic functions directly related to the process of fulfilling agency need. A larger acquisition context must be identified for the federal government that also accounts for how new capabilities and their requirements are generated and vetted, how the agency contributes to their portion of the President's annual budget and allocates resources, and how projects, programs, and contracts are governed and executed. This larger acquisition context is referred to as Big A. Within Big A, there are three strategic decision processes, or legs, which are driven by different factors. Those three legs are requirements, which are driven by acquisition needs, programming and budgeting, which is driven by the fiscal year planning calendar, and governance, which is driven by the successful completion of acquisition events and milestones. With this dynamic and oftentimes conflicting interests of the Big A stakeholders, you need project and program managers, or PMs, contracting professionals, and other integrated team members who are flexible and tolerant of change. An effective and successful PM actively manages the cost, schedule, and program performance risks within these three legs of acquisition. Sometimes the three legs of acquisition do not seamlessly link together without the PM's active and constant surveillance, action, and reaction, which makes this the ultimate juggling act for the federal acquisition PM. Performing in the Big A environment also requires the PM to take a proactive, cradle-to-grave approach to the acquisition process, from discovering the need that fills a capability gap to the eventual disposal or decommission of an asset when it comes to the end of its useful life, or discontinuation of services no longer needed. Now that you have an idea of the larger context of Big A, let's look at each of the three strategic decision processes, or legs, by starting with the requirements leg. Acquisition needs, based on the agency's core mission, are identified during the agency's strategic planning process. Agency needs can be driven from the bottom up by end users, top down by upper management, or a combination of the two. When organizations discover their capability gaps during their strategic planning process, filling the gaps starts a process of performing an analysis of alternatives to determine whether the best solution is to contract out, change internal business processes or practices, redirect internal resources, modify the requirement, and/or implement policy changes. Once the decision has been made to acquire a new product or service solution to fill a capability gap, requirements for this asset must be defined, developed, vetted, and prioritized in order to successfully compete for the finite agency funding. When requirements are approved for funding, they have landed above the agency's acquisition budget cut line. This prioritization is sometimes referred to as planning. Changing policy priorities, technological advances, and other factors all impact how agency needs come about and oftentimes make requirements hard to define and predict along a real-world timeline. The challenge is to predict and then derive these programmed requirements in such a manner that they coincide with the agency's budget building process for inclusion in the President's budget and are expressed in terms of the outcomes the government is seeking. Poorly defined and constantly changing requirements are the prime reasons for failures in the acquisition process and may put the entire program at risk. Starting an acquisition with poorly defined requirements causes problems throughout the program lifecycle, including cost overruns, schedule delays, and/or a less than optimal solution delivery to meet agency needs. Next, let's look at programming and budgeting, the second leg of Big A. The budgeting leg of acquisition is driven by something more predictable, although finite and inflexible, the calendar. An agency's programming and budgeting process to capture funding and resources is driven by the fiscal year and calendar year. That budget is due to Congress no later than the first working Monday of February each year. When it comes to budgeting, agencies must plan and program using the output of the requirements generation process and assemble their funding needs early in the planning cycle to get into the presidential budget on time. So in a typical budgeting cycle, the agency may begin to put together its fiscal year president's budget submission as many as 2 years before it is due. Next, the president's budget goes through congressional enactment where it is discussed, revised, passed back and forth between the House and Senate committees, and then hopefully approved in the form of the Authorization and Appropriations Acts by the start of the fiscal year, October 1st. The Authorization Act authorizes a program to exist, but it's the Appropriations Act that provides funding and permission to obligate government funds. Funding authority is then distributed from the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, through the layers of comptroller functions until the agency ends up with funding authority to obligate and spend. If Congress doesn't pass the budget by October 1st, then Congress must pass and the President must sign a continuing resolution, or CR, that lasts until Congress formally passes and the President signs the budget for that fiscal year. When operating under a CR, agencies have specific rules and restrictions on their funding obligations. At any given time, agencies could be in the budgeting process for the upcoming fiscal year, while simultaneously working on the execution of the current fiscal year budget and spending a prior year's multi-year use funds budget. For example, let's say today is March 30th, 2013, and you are looking at calendar year 2013. You will see that fiscal year 2012 and fiscal year 2013 are also part of this calendar year. This means you could be executing or spending your fiscal year 2012 or a prior year's funds if they were appropriated for a multi-year use, and executing fiscal year 2013 and prior year funds, all while engaging with Congress for the fiscal year 2014 enactment process, performing fiscal year 2015 programming for submission to the next president's budget, conducting fiscal year 2016 and other out-year planning all at once. As you can see, this is a tough timing challenge for the PM managing the programming and budgeting within the 3 legs of acquisition. Finally, let's look at acquisition governance, the third leg of Big A. The governance decision process includes a PM's and contracting officers, or COs, compliance rules within the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or FAR, for contracting and the procurement cycle, as well as an agency's management framework and how the PM and integrated product teams, or IPTs, move the acquisition along in the project lifecycle from concept definition through project closeout. The PM is accountable for the entire governance process, ensuring an on-schedule and within budget delivery of a product or service that meets the needs of the agency. An agency's IPT has representatives from all stakeholder domains, such as contracting, systems engineering, finance, legal, and other functional representatives. Each domain has its own purpose, has a voice on each task or action, which makes it a powerful tool for project success. Together, the PM and IPTs are in charge of the lifecycle management framework. The CO is responsible for managing the contract actions and project delivery in accordance with the FAR, along with the project lifecycle. The CO follows guidance according to the FAR and any supplemental agency guidance governing the contracting process. Combined with the PM and IPT actions, it's a team effort. While the life cycle and procurement cycle are different, they are integrated. There is one life cycle framework for a project, start to finish. Then, within that framework, there can be multiple procurement cycles along the life cycle path. Of course, not all projects require a full life cycle approach. A project life cycle approach can be tailored according to cost, schedule, or performance risk, availability of a suitable item, products, or services in the commercial marketplace, advances in technology, or the need to develop a unique capability not readily available in the commercial marketplace. For example, if the requirement is best filled by either an available commercial item or a modifiable commercial item, then you would use a shortened commercial buy lifecycle. A requirement for a unique item that must be designed, prototyped, tested, manufactured, and then fielded, or for complex services, requires a full lifecycle planning model. The point is that lifecycle phases and milestones adjust according to how the need will be filled. Whatever cycle is involved, having each represented domain on the IPT is required for any project to be successful, and when properly managed by the PM, brings powerful leverage for managing a successful program. Ultimately, it is the people who are the keys to success. Federal PMs operate in a complex business environment while managing 3 strategic decision processes and each of their unique drivers in the Big A: requirements, needs, budgets, calendar, and governance needed for project success. All of which makes acquisition and project or program management decisions in the federal sector unlike any other arena in private or public business environments. For more information on Big A and project management, please see the Project Managers (PM) Guidebook at fai.gov.